I want to start with a quote that I heard a few years ago that when I heard it, I thought that is so true and people need to be mindful of it. And the quote is, "It is easier to believe a lie that you've heard 1,000 times than it is to believe the truth that you've just heard for the first time." Now, I want you to think about that in terms of this subject of racism and how it has affected the whole discussion, how perpetuated lies, how misinformation. We've already touched on some of the things. In fact, the last half of this series of classes are going to deal with it even more. But we're going to be talking about the lies that have been perpetuated that have really fueled and enabled racism to sound credible. As mentioned previously, one of the ways of justifying racism is to claim that, one, black skin was the curse of Cain or Ham. Another so-called justification of racism is the claim that blacks came more from monkeys, highlighting supposed shared features as part of evolution. Another supposed justification is that there was a scientific basis for racism when we discovered that it was really about colonialism, about power, about money, that nations from Europe could go into Africa or South America and ravage the land, ravage the people, and then claim it as their own. So a lot of these lies that have been repeated are lies that help line the pockets of those who were spreading those lies. Adolf Hitler said, "If you tell a big enough lie and tell it frequently enough, it will be believed." That's very similar to the quote that I shared earlier. So what does that have to do with racism? What do lies, what does the repetition of lies have to do with racism? Any of you speak to that?
I think it brainwashes people so that they don't care about looking for the truth.
Okay. It brainwashes people. It, in some cases, affirms what people want to hear anyway. And so they don't have to think. They don't have to search for what is true. They've been given the lie that they want to hear, and then they go forward with it. Other thoughts? What do the big lies and repeating those lies have to do with racism? Some of you will remember, I think it was Jimmy last week in our interviews who talked about a black woman who worked as a maid in a home, and someone came and talked about I don't remember the details, so forgive me about that. The point that I'll get to is the main thing. But this black maid had asked, well, what tint of color was his skin? And she went on to say, the darker they are, the more dangerous they are, or something to that effect. And Jimmy made the point that when you hear it enough yourself, you begin to believe it, even when it is a lie that in some ways implicates you. And she had heard that so many times that she believed it enough to repeat it to somebody else. And so those kinds of things that linger, and we're going to come back to their impact on life in general. Other thoughts about what lies have to do with racism? Again, I just want to remind you of some that have been used over the years, like blacks are inferior, or whites are superior, or slavery is from God. You hear the lies 1,000 times, they're easy to believe. If you hear the truth once, it doesn't sound reasonable. Which I think, my brothers and sisters, is a real important warning to us, not only about racism, but about any subject. That if you don't question, if you don't do your research, if you don't find out whether what is being said is true or not, then you're susceptible to being deceived by any lie. And so we need to be people who are of the truth, and that we work very hard to make sure that the truth is spoken, and that we confront with love and respect, but we confront things that are lies. All right? So yeah, you sure can.
It's kind of ironic. Just this past week, my favorite show is Little House on the Prairie. And I was watching an episode just a few days ago. And again, the setting is the late 1800s. And it was kind of highlighting an incident of racism. There was a black man who had moved into the town. He was working odd jobs and as a farmer. And he had a run-in with Mrs. Olson. Those of you know who she is. But anyway, there was like an insinuation that blacks were uneducated and really incapable of doing anything other than like manual labor. So again, I think that's just an old, wrong way of thinking things. I look at Joel and Jimmy and Gaston from last week, and I think they got way more education than I'll ever have. So it's just, it made me sad, but it just kind of highlighted what we've been talking about.
Laurie has to get her Little House on the Prairie inserted into our discussion. So that's hers for tonight. Tammy, I'm sorry, you were about to say something?
No, I was just gonna say that, when I was a kid growing up, and I don't remember where I heard it from, but we were told that, white people were more smarter than black people. And that's something that I really believed. I was a small child, so I didn't understand, but that was something that we were told, that we weren't as smart. And so I thought that was just the way it was, until of course I got older. But also the colorism, even within the Black community, as I was growing up as well, that we were told that people that were lighter skin, black people that were of lighter skin, you know, were better than people that were of darker skin. And especially, you know, back in the days, you know, of slavery, you know, you usually have the darker skin out in the field and the lighter skin, you know, that worked within the home.
Mm.
But yeah, that, I mean, and even with black people, you know, the hair texture and stuff like that, if your texture of hair, you know, is more, you know, white, um, maybe because you're mixed somewhere down the line, then, you know, you're better than. So even within the black community, you know, we would talk about one another, you know, you're darker than I am, you're lighter than I am, so on and so forth. But that was something that I came up with as well. And I think Spike Lee even made a movie about that, you know, about colorism and how black people treat other black people because of, you know, what we're told.
Well, isn't that brilliant in a way? You know, all of a sudden you don't even have to make the argument anymore. You've got people fighting amongst themselves, making the argument for you. And
Right.
so that's part of the, I use the word brilliance of it. I'm using that advisedly, but you kind of keep your hands clean that way. And this is kind of a prelude to what we're going to be talking about, I think, in one of the later sessions, maybe even a little tonight. But those of you who are sports fans know that for years, I mean, there's even discussion among the NFL about head coaches, but for years, you did not see a black quarterback in the NFL. Why? The thinking was that they were not intelligent enough to handle the offense and leading the team and calling plays and things like that. But who's in the Super Bowl on Saturday, Sunday? Well, Texas Tech, um, Texas Tech's pride, Patrick Mahomes is one of the two quarterbacks.
Hey, Dale,
Yeah,
this is Charles. I've had trouble logging in and I had to go through Facebook. So I still don't have my my video.
you
But
look good
I've
in the
heard,
picture.
yeah, I forgot what I look like. How about that? No, but a lot of people are saying that Patrick Mahomes is there because he is half white and half black. And that makes up the difference.
Again, think about think about if that kind of propaganda is what you hear your entire life as a black person. Imagine how that impacts you. I mean, you, in the case that you're talking about, Charles, you cannot even celebrate Patrick Mahomes getting to the Super Bowl because somebody has to say, well, you know, his mother is white.
Yeah.
And so that kind of put down, constantly finding ways to put down and oppress. And so that's going to lead into to later in our class. But I want to go back. We talked about this a few weeks ago to the 1923 Lubbock Ordinance. And I'm just going to read section 4 because it's a good summary. And I want to hear your reaction again to it. From what you hear. The fact that Negroes and persons of African descent and persons containing as much as 1/8 Negro blood are residing in various portions of the city and their residence is dangerous to the health and pollutes the earth and atmosphere, creates an emergency and necessity, that the removal of the charter requiring an ordinance to be read at 2 several meetings be suspended, and this ordinance be acted at the meeting of its introduction and effective upon publication. In other words, we have to we have to enact this ordinance immediately because of the danger that of having Black people in our community brings. What's your reaction to that?
Well, they're instilling fears. That's the main goal there, to get everybody, I mean, the white community clouded with fear. And that goes on today still.
Yes, it does. Other reactions?
Went ahead after that and put a lot of industry over on the east side of town. Some things like the oil mills and cotton storage facilities and things that are probably a danger to people's health. But I guess they justified it by saying, well, it's the Blacks that live over there.
Mm.
So it wasn't just saying, they need to be away from everybody else. It justified their putting pollutants over there.
So what Anise is saying, as best I understood it, for those of you who may not have heard her very well, she was talking about industry, where there truly is danger associated with the industry, and that the fact that much of it is on the east side of town, and the rationale is, well, that's where the Blacks live, so that's no big deal. Again, shows an insensitivity that we're going to see is not consistent with the word and will of God. Any other reactions to the ordinance?
Yeah, one more thing, Dale.
Yeah.
If you live over there and order a pizza, you cannot get a pizza delivered to your home. You have to go and get it.
The thinking is what then, Charles?
Well, that they'll probably get possibly a fee of being robbed.
Yeah.
Mugged.
Yeah. It's dangerous. You can't go over there because it's too dangerous. Yeah. Well, why is I-27 located where it is in Lubbock? Anybody know? I mean, obviously the context of this class should tell you why it is.
It's a boundary.
Go ahead, Duan.
Really, it's a boundary for residents and business. And, this discussion reflects back to where a Black was just considered, what was it, 3/7 of a person in the census. In other words, it was saying really that a Black had economic worth, but did not have citizenship worth.
And back in the days of slavery, the economic worth was if a Black person got sick and home remedies didn't work, they called the vet for him.
See, those kinds of things that probably, Charles, I mean, you weren't living then, so that was passed down to you. Those are bits of information that I think catch some of us by surprise. That such treatment went on, but it did. So I appreciate you sharing that. So I-27 was a clear divide between whites and Blacks. And someone may say, well, people can move to anywhere they want to in the city. One of the things I've learned through the deep listening of the Truth and Reconciliation meetings that have been led by Jim Beck is that the east side of the city was once a very thriving community with businesses, a hospital, doctors. That's not the case anymore. And ironically, government programs, which may have been well intended to help actually created circumstances that caused the thriving nature of the east side of the city not to thrive so well anymore. So again, we see a disparity that's in our own city. And someone may say, well, you know, the 1923 ordinance, the divide caused by I-27, it was just true to the time. That's just the way things were then. Here's the part that disturbs me about that, brothers and sisters. Lubbock is probably as churchy a place as I've ever lived in my life. Why weren't Christians speaking up and speaking God's truth to a world that was mistreating humans created in God's image? I know it wouldn't have been popular, but why did Christians not only stay silent in some cases, but in other cases actually made the problem worse?
So the Christians were just as ignorant as the non-Christians.
Okay, so sometimes it was simply a matter of ignorance. We believe the lies.
You believe the lies.
And the fear of, if there were businessmen in town, people will not do business at that place if they failed to want to integrate or bring blacks into their worship services. So economic value had a lot to do with it also.
All right, so economic pressures, ignorance, social pressures were certainly a piece of it. Again, as people of God, in the Green Lawn community, I don't want us to ever allow our work as a church, our ministry as a church, to be determined by things other than God. And even if that means standing against what everyone around us thinks, let's stand for what's right and true no matter what.
Amen.
And so that's what I would admonish us to do. And I hope that this class is helpful in doing that. Go ahead, Virginia.
I think that's one of the things like I said, I was raised Catholic, but I was growing up there, even my own people treated me really bad. And I remember going to youth group activities, and I would be sitting in the corner because, I mean, we were very poor. And I just, growing up now, getting older now, I see what they were doing to me, but they wouldn't have anything to do with me, and they'd always just ignore me or say bad things about me or whatever. And so instead of staying there, I started searching for something else, because I knew that God was not like that. I don't know how I knew it, but I knew it. And so I started searching, and I thank God that my mother allowed me to go. But looking back, I guess that's what pushed me to start searching and wanting to be a better person. And even now, just as a Christian, to look at other people. And like my dad always said, he said, don't look at the color of the skin. He said, look inside, look at their heart, see who they are there. And so I am thankful for that.
Virginia, what prejudice did you experience?
Oh, man, a lot. Well, like I said, we were poor, and we lived, again, in Post. We had a dividing line. It was the railroad tracks. And so we lived across the tracks, and my dad was he was crippled. He worked odd jobs, and I didn't see it then, but I think that everybody saw. They always wondered, how did we get our money, and how, basically, I don't know. They just wouldn't talk to me, and both my brother and I had to share clothes. And it's kind of interesting, whenever I came, we didn't have a lot for Christmas. So I always remember I would always dread going to school because I couldn't share that I hadn't got anything for Christmas. And the kids would come in and show their nice little dolls, their little Miss Beasleys and things like that. And they would make fun of the clothes I wore or how I dressed. And in first grade, we had all the little Hispanic kids had to be in one class, so we weren't allowed to speak Spanish at school. And if we did, we'd get rapped on the hand by a ruler. And I hated school. And they always said, well, you think you're better than we are, to me, my own people. And I'm like, no, I don't. I want to I do want to be better. I want to get away from the being poor. I want to work for what I have. And it was a struggle, but I did it. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Well, you talked about experiencing prejudice because of poverty and having a Hispanic background. So those kinds of prejudices are there. Again, people often judge based on external, surface, superficial things. And as we're going to see tonight, that is not the way God sees things.
Right.
It is not the way God sees things. So before we get to some passages of scripture, I want us to better understand systemic racism. That is a phrase that has been tossed around over the last few months. Anybody want to give a shot at what systemic racism is?
Does it reflect how a person was raised, or a heritage in a family? It's just that's the way it was, and we accept it.
Sort of. I mean, you're touching on an aspect of it. Systemic racism is about the barriers that still exist because of the long-standing biases, prejudices, laws, and consequences of those biases, prejudices, and laws that still affect people, that still affect decisions, that still affect circumstances today. In other words, it is so ingrained after, in this country, 400 years of racism, and most of those years state-supported slavery, that it's still there. It's still there, though it may be against the law. It's still part of the system. There's often not the equality of life chances. There's often not the equal opportunities there. Systemic racism shows up in housing, education, jobs, the prison system. In fact, I have a book that I read as I worked on my master's degree called Blaming the Victim. And it talks about what happens when a person doesn't have the same opportunities and chances that another person has. And the reason they don't have the same chances is because of this systemic racism that we've talked about. And there have been a lot of efforts, like affirmative action, that have been aimed at trying to give those opportunities to people who have not had those opportunities. But all I'm saying to you is this. Again, we are roughly, well, we're more than 50 years removed from the enactment of civil rights legislation in our country. But because of how ingrained that has been for the centuries before that, racism still shows up in subtle ways. And I think if we can acknowledge that as white people, you know, one of the things I so appreciated Shelley saying last week is that the people who are going to have to change this are white people. Okay? We have to be the ones who stand up and say, that's not right. Tammy, you wanted to say something.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I was gonna say, like, for instance, and I don't want to really bring up anything political, but one of the examples you were talking about in form of systemic racism, like a great example was the voter suppression and stuff they were talking about, you know, they wanted to take away a lot of the votes, but they just happened to be, you know, in the areas where Black people were. So it's like your vote doesn't count. So let's just take those votes out of the way and just count the other votes. I mean, that's something that they've been fighting for a long time in the Black, you know, areas. And, you know, also a lot of the comments were made. You had of course, the Black Lives Matter, and then you have the thing that happened at the Capitol, you know, and a lot of people and reporters have been talking about how, you know, if they were Black people or brown people, you know, they would have been shot on the spot. You know, they wouldn't have even been able to make it into the Capitol. It's just, you know, it's just a totally different thing. And that just goes to show how the system, you know, works.
Yeah, and you actually are mentioning something that I'm going to bring up again about the two Americas that we live in. But you've alluded to it, but I'm going to emphasize it more a little bit later. So, how do you think? This is one of the questions on your study sheet. How do you think it would affect you if you became convinced through experience that there are uncontrollable barriers and hindrances that keep you from pursuing your dreams or experiencing success? How would that affect you?
Dale?
Yep.
This is Peter.
Yeah.
I want to go to a little different side of this. All of my kinfolks came to the United States in the early 20s from Sweden. They weren't highly educated, but they were hard workers. Well, of course, when they got here, you know, the one thing that was on their side, even though they were, you know, I remember jokes about Swedes being square-headed and dumb, but they were really hard workers. And if you put them on a job, they would turn out a lot of work. But that, you know, they were lower class, but they were blonde, okay, and they were white. Well, down the street, there were Puerto Ricans in their ghetto, and there were Italians. And the Italians were treated badly because of their connection to crime and the picture, or, you know, what they were labeled with. Most stereotypes do have some basis from somewhere in some number. And to me, as we've talked about this, the only solution to that, okay, is not that there aren't always going to be differences between people. There's a right and a wrong way, and treating people right has to be a stronger thing in our lives than pointing to the things we see that frighten us. Well, that's one thing to do, okay, if you see a pit bull walking down the road towards you and being nervous about that pit bull. That's entirely different than justifying yourself for prejudging people whether it was Swedes or whether it was Italians or whether it was blacks. We have to just say it's wrong, it's evil, God can't stand it. God says if you treat other people that way, you don't love, and if you don't love, you're not going to be in heaven. That's a solution more than trying to decide who's more guilty in any particular situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, the admonishment is that we become voices for that kind of love and opposition to anything that undermines that. I'm going to answer my own question so we can jump into some scripture here. If I felt like that every direction I turned, I kept banging into a barrier and I never could get past that barrier, I think at some point I'd probably quit trying. And in some cases, I might just become what I think people see me as. Now, as a counselor, I'm going to tell you that happens more often than you think. That people expectations that others have of certain people, they fulfill those. They become self-fulfilling prophecies in people's lives. And so, again, what I'm trying to help us as white people better understand is that this continuing to run into a roadblock is what a lot of black people have experienced. And so you can understand the frustration, you can understand the discouragement that goes with that. So let's look at what God says about all of this, and let's look at what truth is. If somebody would read, please, Genesis chapter 1, 26 through 31, please. Anybody who's got it? You can.
Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food, and so it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Morning was the sixth day.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. What is the origin of every single individual on the planet?
Yes.
From God through one couple, Adam and Eve. You all might not want to own me, but at some place, somewhere along the line, you and I are cousins. Okay? We all have that common heritage. There is no such thing really as racism, as races. There's one race. There's the human race, and we're all part of that human race. In fact, this particular lesson I've entitled in the image of God. So what does it say about the value of every human life since humans were created in the image of God? Not just the lives of white people, not just the lives of whatever skin color you want to choose. What does it say about the value of every human life?
That is precious.
We are holy because God is holy.
And so since every person has intrinsic value, because we were all formed from the coming together of Adam and Eve, every life should be treated, as Charles said, as precious. There's no 2/5, 4/7, 16/15. I'm making up percentages for those of you who are math people now. There's all of us have intrinsic value because of the way God made us. Let's drive this home even more. Over a few chapters, Genesis chapter 9, 18 and 19. Somebody read those verses.
Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated.
Okay. The population of how much of the earth?
The whole earth.
The whole earth. So the whole line of humanity, God became so disturbed by what was going on the earth prior to the flood that he said, I got to wipe it all out. The only way that I can salvage humanity is by wiping it out and starting over with Noah and his family. So the whole line of humanity came from Noah and Mrs. Noah after the flood. So what does that mean when it comes to the matter of racism?
We're all the same. You know?
We're all the same.
We're all of the same spiritual value. Okay, we're not all equally capable of everything there is. Some of us are fast runners and some aren't, and some are good at this and some aren't. But the value, spiritual value in God's eyes is clearly 100% equal.
And as people of God, we need to be saying that clearly. Okay?
But pride speaks against that ideal.
Yeah. We like feeling superior, don't we? As humans. Our pride is fueled by a sense of superiority or self-righteousness. And so we're understanding that racism was something, again, that was used for material gain and colonialism, but it also reveals part of the fallenness of humanity, that we feel the need to be superior to someone else. And that's been true of human history. But please, as God's people, understand that when it comes to how God sees things, we are all of one race. Genesis 3, verse 20.
Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living.
What was the basis of Eve's name?
The mother of all the living.
She's the mother of all living. That means again that we all come from the same bloodline. Skin color is an artificial barrier that some people with evil intent invented. That's what we have to understand. That's what we have to be able to communicate to other people, that this artificial barrier is something that people with evil intent invented. It is not, it was never been in the heart and mind of God. Response to that before we move on to Acts chapter 17.
Dale,
Yep.
most of us are familiar with the Rwandan situation. There, an artificial divide of the whole country was done back in 200 years ago and created this terrible, and it was 10% that were lighter and 9%, and they treated each other badly in that way and measured each other that way. And you can go to India, 36% of the Indians are labeled not legally anymore, but they're untouchable. They're dark, 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 and they're picked on and made fun of and don't get opportunities with the light Indians still to this day. And so it's, we just keep it, so obvious things you're bringing up. It's an evil that we simply have to confess and say, okay, it's not something we can live with. We're not going to, we're each going to do our part. And that's why, a man like Gandhi was such a lighthouse to the world, because he refused, the things that he could have had, because he knew it was wrong. And that's the bottom line for us. It's wrong. It's evil.
Amen. And you alluded, Peter, as you talked about Gandhi, you referring to Gandhi reminds us that standing for what is right may have a cost to it. And we have to be ready to deal with that cost. You mentioned the situation in Rwanda. I may come back to that again later. But let's read Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 34. Somebody read that for us, please.
Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their hands." How far?
Through 34.
Okay, thank you. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others.
Okay, Get the context. Thank you, Maria. Get the context. Paul is in the hotbed of intellectuals and sophistication of his day. He's with the brain center. He's with the people who are in the know and leading the thoughts of the world of the day. All right. What was Paul's purpose in the sermon to the people in Athens? What was his purpose in preaching to them? What's he doing?
To show that God has no respect of persons.
All right. He's introducing them to the real God. He's looked around the city as he's walked in, and there's a God at every corner in Athens. Okay. There's an idol everywhere. There are idols everywhere. I mean, it boggled Paul's mind as he looked at all these idols. And so he said, he took advantage of one of them, and he said, I saw this idol to the unknown God. And so I want to tell you about this God. So he's trying to tell them who the real God is. And so where did Paul trace the lineage of humans? Verse 29. Verse 28 and 29 and 26 and 27. Charles has already said it. Where does he trace the lineage of humans?
Springs of God.
Back to God.
He traces the lineage of humans back to God, and he doesn't say there's one set of people that came from Zeus. There's another set of people who came from Athena. He says every person on the planet traces their lineage to God. If you don't know the real God, then you are vulnerable to the lies that can be perpetuated by not knowing him. That's why Paul wanted to clear that up. Go ahead, Peter.
Something I never thought of. This is not changed just because a people close their gene pool. You know, we went to war in the 19th century with the Japanese because when our sailors would get shipwrecked on the shore, they'd go in and father children. Okay, they had a jail. They put American sailors in and said, as soon as next boat comes on, you get up and leave, but we do not want your genes in. Well, they felt the same way about Koreans in Africa. They looked down at each other. Indian tribes look down at other tribes. And so it's not just a black-white thing. It's something we have all struggled with. And, thinking we're better because we're in the gene pool that happens to be the cool one or the one that's wanted right now. And Christians have to reject that as well.
Yes. Again, we're focusing in on the racism and prejudice that have damaged so many black people for hundreds of years. But you're right. This human evil intention of being superior and clannish and thinking you're better than is all over the planet, and it takes different forms. But it is probably not been, well, there are some cases it has been, and Rwanda is one of those. But what we've experienced in our country has injured a lot of people. And I, again, am exhorting us to be people who are part of changing that narrative, changing that story in our country. That we do that as God's people.
Dale,
Yeah.
in Job, which is part of the wisdom literature, we should learn something from this. When chapter 1, when the God or the children of God came to God, Satan came along with him. And God asked Satan, where have you been? He said, I've been walking to and fro, up and down on this earth. He's been doing that since the beginning of time, instilling hate into people's lives. So, I mean, God is alive and well today. He will be, Satan is alive and well. He's walking to and fro. He's in Lubbock. He's in Dallas. He's in California. He's in Florida. And if we're not careful, if we allow Satan to overtake us as individuals, and certainly as Christians, then we will be guilty of perpetuating this thing we call racism. Whether it's Native Americans or whether it's Hispanic Americans or Black African Americans, or whether it's whatever. If we're not careful, if we let Satan walk to and fro, we don't take a stand, then we become a part of it. We essentially become a part of that traditional racism in America.
So again, we have an opportunity to help everyone. And again, this is the theme of this particular class, of helping everyone know the truth that when God created the world, he created one race from Adam and Eve. Even when he cleared off the planet again, there was still one race through Noah and Mrs. Noah. And therefore, because we were created in the image of God, every person is precious, priceless, and should be treated with respect and dignity.
When we need a life-saving blood transfusion, we don't look at the label of the race where that life is in the blood came from.
No. In desperate situations, we're a little less racist or prejudiced. Well, that's what I have for tonight. Please remember again that everyone you encounter is priceless because of the value that God has placed on them. And let's treat them accordingly. May God bless you the rest of the week. We'll see you Sunday. Good night.